Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hey, welcome to Turning a Wheel. Once again, we're here to discuss a different sign as I've been working my way through the various astrological signs in individual segments. We are now at the time when we're going to be talking about Virgo. And by the time this segment airs, it should be time for the Virgos to be around. Virgo is from August 22nd to September 21st. So if you're born in that time span, you are going to be a Virgo. Virgo is a mutable sign. It is a mutable earth sign. Mutability, as you know, is the signs of the at the end of the zodiac, which deal with sort of the conclusion and the wrapping up of types of events. Very similar to sort of being the people who sort of close the door, turn off the lights at the end of the day, so to speak. Being an earth sign, it is in friendly harmony with Capricorns and Tauruses, also earth signs, and they are known for a wide variety of characteristics. They are typically represented by the sixth house in astrology, and the ruling sign, the ruling planet rather, is Mercury. The sixth house in astrology is the house of service, and this is what Virgos are best at. They are service-oriented people. In that regard, they are multi-dimensional, extremely meticulous, very much a perfectionist, and they are very good, and especially when it comes to service. When I say service, that doesn't mean a waitress or a waiter or a bartender, although sometimes those people are those people. We think more of people along the lines of dental assistants, doctors, lawyers, people who actually work to serve others. Their greater goal is to work in service. And that's why their skill set is incredibly valuable. The ability to be meticulous, to fine-tune, to move slowly, to blend and spend time on the minutiae. They're very much detail-oriented. They also tend to be very meticulous and orderly. Anybody who has Virgo as a sun sign or Virgo as a rising sign, you would recognize these characteristics immediately in the way that they act and are their characteristics. They can also be sometimes a little bit critical without even knowing it. There's a certain body language that they give off, that gives a sort of a sense of, criticism, not necessarily harsh, but it's a very subtle things. You can tell their opinions. You can see that they're not quite in agreement all the time. And these are just broad-based characteristics of the Virgos. Don't forget, all signs are a composite of positives and negatives. We all have assets, we all have liabilities, so it makes sense that every sign would have this. This is very much the case. With all of these, they're very clean, very organized. There's some odd characteristics you'll find in the Virgos. They have very clean hands, for example. You'll see this, and that's why they're good to be doctors. If you're having somebody operate on your heart or fixing your teeth, you want to be sure that their hands are clean. This is just a personality trait of a Virgo. You'll find them to be very meticulous and detail-oriented when it comes to all of those things. They're very fussy sometimes and organized, service-oriented. Doctors, dentists, lawyers, those kinds of people who are very oriented towards the individual of helping others. This is their real goal. It's the sign of the servant is the sign in the astrological chart, if you saw that. And when we look at this, as I said, Mercury is the ruler, so oftentimes we'll find Virgos involved with writing. Some sort of technical writing is very popular with Virgos, communications, television, broadcasting, wherever there is that need for detail. And when I get to the end of the segment and I start listing off some of the famous people, you will recognize what I'm talking about immediately when you start to see the names that come up underneath the sign of the Virgos. But what I'm going to do before we get there is go through, as I mentioned in many segments before, the time of birth determines the placement of your chart in the greater wheel of the zodiac. So that timing, which is the birth date, the birth time, is incredibly important when it comes to the accuracy of the individual chart. And in that timing, we get closer to the precision and the granularity needed to understand what a person really is. And that's what orients the houses. The houses are the scenes in the life where the activity happens. So when you think about the sun, being in a particular house, that's where you're going to see the amplification and the manifestation of that service-oriented characteristic of Virgo come to light. So we're going to go through the houses. There's 12 houses in the wheel. We'll go through them, and then I'll give you a list of some of the famous Virgos in the world who are, you'll understand. Virgos, by the way, are the wealthiest sign in the zodiac. They're the ones that are the best oriented towards money, and I think that's largely because of their ability to negotiate and to be adaptable, which is mutability, and their ability to hone in on details. Accountants, financiers, those people are very much organized and a good, clear idea of what it means to be detailed in that respect. So those are interesting. Now, let's start off. If you have Virgo on the ascendant or in your first house, you are going to give off that presence of being a very neat, organized, meticulously crisp, sort of organized person. Maybe somewhat reserved, maybe somewhat standoffish a little bit, but very meticulous, very observant. Oftentimes, this kind of person will spend a lot of time looking at the small details and as a result, miss sometimes the bigger picture. This is very much of a common Virgo trait as well. If you have a Virgo sun in the second house, you're going to find that you have a strong propensity for money. This is where you'll find your accountants. This is where you'll find your people who work in hedge funds, those who are good with numbers. This is exactly where you're going to find them. It's going to be that strong characteristic of being able to understand the details. This is where details really comes in. These guys are masters at spreadsheets and Excel and number crunching and all these things. This is really where you're going to find that great quality come through in a very, very profound way. It's one of the best placements for Virgo. When we bring Virgo into the third house, this is the house of communication. This is the house that rules, that Mercury rules. So therefore we would find people who are writers, broadcast journalists, investigative reporters. Investigative reporters are very key in this third house placement because they are able to drill down and get those details, the questions that can't be answered. They are meticulous, they're dogged in their responses. They want to find out what the answer is, and so they're going to keep digging. This is a great spot for a Virgo, especially with that inquisitive mind, and this is where journalism and knowing your facts is where the Virgo really shines. This is a spot where they are spot on the target because they understand the details, they're willing to do that, and they have that wonderful ability to communicate very crisply and organized. When we see Virgo in the fourth house is the house of home and family and children. This is where you're going to see, excuse me, a very neat house. You're going to see a house where someone is incredibly organized. And you may know Virgos whose houses are a mess, but I guarantee there's parts of those houses that are very neat. Each Virgo has an area of their life where they spend a meticulous amount of time being organized, whether it's their CD collection or their iTunes or their desktop on their computer, even their bathrooms or their closets. That's not to say that universally all Virgos are going to be neat every part of their house, but generally speaking, they are going to be very meticulous and organized when it comes to that kind of quality. You want that organization. When we see the Virgo sun arriving in the fifth house, we will see the young, childish, creative, childlike, creative type of individual. The sixth house is creativity, it's children, it's laughter, it's fun. Virgos can sometimes be a little bit sober, but when they are in when they're in the fifth house, when the sun is in the fifth house of a Virgo, you'll find an artist that's very detail-oriented. You might find one who spends a great deal of time not necessarily doing abstract art, more precise art. Someone who's very much of a draftsman, for example, or an architect. Loves those details, loves those lines, loves the ability to be able to get those crisp ideas in there and to have that certain form and function that's very critical to them. It's a real detail-oriented Virgo quality to have that. The next house we move to is the seventh house. The seventh house is the house of relationships, as you've heard me speak many times. And when we look at the seventh house, we see the house of relationships. The Virgo in the seventh house is going to be a kind of a Felix Unger kind of person from The Odd Couple, if you remember. Very meticulous, very oriented towards helping the other person. This is the kind of a partner, if you're with another earth sign or you have a harmonious Virgo in your life, and they have a seventh house sun, you'll find this person being very willing to do a lot and to bend over backwards to help the other person, to help move the process forward. They may be the ones that spend a lot of time making sure that the home and the relationship has a sense of balance. And they're also, interestingly enough, if you found a Virgo, which is a mutable sign, tends to be more adaptable and adaptive and flexible. You pair them with, say, a fire earth sign, a cardinal earth sign or a fixed earth sign such as a Taurus, you would find that the Virgos would be the ones that would adapt. Whereas the Taurus wants to be in charge, the Virgo might say, okay, you want pizza tonight, I'll get pizza tonight. So they're very adaptable in that regard. And they're very willing to sort of give up for others in the relationship. The next house we move to is the 8th house. The 8th house also deals with finance and outside money, and particularly spirituality and elders. This is where large organizations come into effect. So large organizations, elderly people, and outside money. So this is where you'd find your hedge fund managers. This is where you find your Wall Street brokers who have that eye for detail and can hone in on the best ideas, who are willing to drill into the details to find the best fund for you to get into. So that's a good place to look for. If you're looking for somebody to manage your money, or you are a person who manages money and you are a Virgo and you're working in large organizations such as a bank, investment counseling, financial advising, excellent spot for you to be. It's a very interesting spot. The next house we move to is the 9th house. The 9th house, with your sun in the 9th house as a Virgo, you're going to be a teacher. You're the person who's going to be teaching and traveling. This is where you might find a travel organizer. You might find somebody who stages events and does traveling. Also people in the religion business. Now that sounds like an odd way of putting it, but ministers, priests who have that strong calling are also pulled into this area, because this 9th house is the house of spirituality, travel, education. A lot of teachers are Virgos because they have that precise idea what to teach. They have the ability to get their thoughts across because of the strong communication skills, and they have a great deal of detail-oriented, which is required if you're trying to teach a classroom of students and you have to deal with a lot of different people. Of course, don't forget, if you've got a Virgo teacher and you get a lot of red ink on your papers, or your tests get a lot of red ink back, that's because they've taken the time to go through those tests and see where the mistakes are. When it comes to travel, obviously a Virgo working in the travel business might be an airline pilot, very good with understanding, and that's what you want. You want somebody who knows what they're doing if they're flying your plane. They're very good with that sort of detail-oriented, technically astute, and to find, as I said, the minutia of all those gauges. You can just picture an airline pilot with all those gauges in front of him. This would be a great spot for someone who was in the travel business, who was a Virgo. So, when we move on to the 10th house, the 10th house is the house of occupation. And occupation, as I've mentioned in other episodes, does not necessarily pertain to how you earn your money. It can, and it can be where you go to work every day, but also the occupation house is how you occupy your time. So if you're staying at home raising children and you're a Virgo with your son in the 10th house, that is your occupation. And in that occupation, you're going to find a very dependable, reliable person that you can always call on. This is where responsibility comes in. This is where the detail-oriented comes in. If you've got an employee who's a Virgo, they're going to be on time. They're going to do good work. They're great as editors because they like that sort of the detail of drilling down and finding the small details. Remember what I said earlier. They don't necessarily see the big picture. They're very focused on the narrow picture sometimes. And I'm going to read you a passage out of the book that supports that, because it really comes down and hones in very nicely about what a Virgo is. It's that ability to be, if you want someone to comb through your taxes and look through legal documents and stuff like that, hire the Virgo, because they're going to go through very methodically and see that all those pieces are there. They like the small details, and in that they're very good. That's the 10th house. As we move into the 11th house, if you've got a sun in Virgo in the 11th house, your best work is done in groups. And as a Virgo, you are a wonderful group player because people can depend upon you to do the right thing and you will always be there. When I say mutability, mutability is oftentimes seen as the ability to adapt, to be flexible, to give in. You know, sometimes if you're in a tussle with somebody and you're in a group, and somebody wants to do something one way and you want to do another way, the Virgo is more likely to defer to the person who's pushing their agenda. So that ability of adaptiveness is a very nice quality. It gives them a certain sense of, they're very diplomatic in that regard because they're adaptable. They can move and edit and move and feel as if they're part of the group. They're also going to be very picky. They may be the ones who keep the books for the organization that you're in. Don't forget, the 11th house has to do with groups of friends, groups of people, business associates, and those that you're associated with. So if you're involved in an organization like a church or a school or a university, and you're in an organization, this is where the Virgo will come in and do those things. They're very good with those small details, like I mentioned before. The last house we come to is the house everybody worries about. It's called the house of transition. So, the house of transition is the 12th house. This is the house where things begin and end. And of course, like every sign, all signs have their moments in time when they begin and they end. And the Virgo is very good at tidying up loose ends. This is one of the things that is sort of common across all mutable signs. They have that ability to sort of, if the cardinal signs start things, the fixed signs do the work. It's the mutable signs that sort of clean up at the end and sort of tie the knot on the package and turn the lights out and go home. That's what the role of the mutable. So Virgos, in that regard, in the 12th house, might be people who look at, perhaps estates and wills, perhaps working in the funeral industry, anywhere where there's transition. HR, human resources, where people are coming and going. This might be a place where you'd find a Virgo in the 12th house. It's all about, beginnings, as I said, and endings. So, and when I refer to the house of the 12th house, I want to come back to, I say this many times, I know, but it's worth saying because people get spooked by the house of the 12th house because it's the house of transition. They think of it as an ending. Yes, it is an ending. And my best example I've used over and over again is that after 9 months of pregnancy, what do we have? We have the birth of a baby. So yes, it's the end of a pregnancy, but it's the birth of a baby. So it's a new beginning. If you can get that idea in your head, that idea of transition in your head as that example, you can begin to look at these transitions in more positive ways. They don't necessarily have to be, oh my God, the sky is falling. This is a time when you can have more levity, more, a greater sense of optimism. We don't always know what's around the corner. People are oftentimes concerned or more inclined to stay in an unpleasant situation because it's familiar, as opposed to a new situation which they don't understand. Now, all of this stuff goes through all of the 12 houses, as I mentioned. The way those houses are set up and what signs fall in which houses and where the sun is in those signs is determined by the birth date. If you don't know this information and you don't know what your chart looks like, I urge you to contact me at turningatthewheel.com. And what you do is you contact me through email and you say, this is my birth date, my birthplace, my birth time. Can you tell me a chart? Once you get the chart, then you'll know exactly where the orientation is of your planets within your unique footprint, your fingerprint in the world, and you'll be able to understand yourself completely better. And knowing that allows you to use timing to its greatest effect, because timing is really everything. You know that as well as anybody else. If you're at the right place in the right time, you can hit the home run. No question about it. Now, this past year, Jupiter has been in Virgo ever since last August of 2015, and it will be going out of Virgo in September of 2016. So it's been a wonderful year. Jupiter in Virgo allows people to have expansion. And this is why it's important to know your planets when they're there, because if you were trying to do something expansive and different over this year and you were a Virgo or had Virgo rising, this would be the time to do it. Another key trick I urge you to understand is that if you know your chart, and if you don't know your chart, you can contact me, as I mentioned, or you can also go to astro.com, astro.com, astro.com. It's Astrodienst in Switzerland, and you can get your chart read there. You can get your chart, at least get a copy of your chart, then you'll know where the planets are. And you'll always want to know what your sun sign is and what your rising sign is. And you read those two at any time you're trying to understand astrology, because at one point in time, if it's not going to be the rising sign, it's going to be the sun sign and vice versa. Matter of fact, there's whole schools of astrological thought that consider the rising sign to be more valid of an indicator of the personality than the actual sun sign. We all think of sun signs as being who we are, and yes, they are a component and a representative of who we are. However, many schools of thought, ancient schools of thought, going back to the esoteric astrologers, believe that the finest and most precise estimation of an individual comes through the rising sign. On my website, turningatthewheel.com, I also have a rising sign calculator. What you do is you enter in your birth date, your birthplace, and your birth time, hit the return button, and it'll tell you what your rising sign is. Very nice to know. Then, when you read my weekly newsletter, which comes out every week, which you can also subscribe to from my website, you will see the passage for the week. And each week, I write out a small passage of what's going to be happening for each sign. Always read your sun sign, always read your rising sign, put those two together, and you'll get a composite of where the action will be happening in your week. This is true for the day, for the month, for the year, for the week, any period of time. I do it by the week on my newsletter, which comes out every Sunday afternoon rather, at 1:30. So I encourage you to do that. Now, as I mentioned before, I want to read a quick passage out of the book here about Virgo. So I think this really sort of summarizes it perhaps better than I've said, and I think it gives you a good idea. And I will read it right here. The Virgo in mind is acute, discriminating, and methodical, with nimble Mercury held down by a concrete earth sign. This person is more of a plotter than a sprinter. A plotter than a sprinter. His efficiency may be impaired by a tendency to fret over trifles that other less conscientious souls would dismiss or fail to notice. This gets back to that point of time where I was talking about the preponderance of details. They understand the details. They may get mired in the details. They may be slow in the details because they're trying to make it perfect. They love perfection. They disdain imperfection. In consequence, he is accused of missing the forest for the trees. There's that phrase I used earlier. He needs to make a special effort to gather up the details he so readily analyzes and to resynthesize them into a comprehensive whole. Now that, to me, really summarizes the kind of person that we are looking at when we talked about a Virgo. That passage really sort of summarizes it very nicely. Now, as I mentioned, I want to get on to some famous names, because I think when you hear the famous names, you'll be able to get a better picture of some of these characteristics that become Virgo. So, well, the first one I have on my list is Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States. He was the vice president to John F. Kennedy, who became president after Kennedy was assassinated, and then ran for president shortly thereafter on his own, under his own name, and went on to become quite a profound president in the history of the United States. He passed the Civil Rights Act. He was immersed in Vietnam. He also opted not to run for a second term. Because he was in the first term as vice president, his real official term began when he ran for himself. He opted out of his second term because he just couldn't do it any longer. He had had enough. But a great deal was accomplished under him. He was a negotiator. He was somebody who spent a great deal of time working across the aisle on different sides, trying to get harmony, and he was adaptable. He was willing to cut ideas and adapt to certain ideas here and there. He was very much of what we call a mutable person. Very powerful, a straddler, someone who was able to accommodate and adapt and bend to anybody who's going on at that time. Very, very important character. The next one's really interesting. Michael Jackson. Who would have thought Michael Jackson would be a Virgo? But when we stop and look at him in his later years, we know he had an obsession with germs. This is very much of a Virgo trait too. He'd always wear these face masks, and he had his hands gloved, and he'd have these odd costumes, and he was lost in this sort of this world. Very particular, very meticulous about the way his recordings were made, which is clearly evident when you see how great his videos came out. He was responsible for all that. He had that quality there, but also that very much of a germaphobe. That sort of quality of being afraid, the kind of an OCD kind of characteristic. Kobe Bryant, the great basketball player. Now, who would have thought that he would be a Virgo? But he is. He's an interesting character. Here's one you're really going to be fascinated with: Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is a Virgo, and in Bernie we see this public servant. Nobody represents or epitomizes the public servant better than Bernie Sanders. You can tell through all of his speeches, all he's done, you can tell that this man is not in it for himself. He's there to help others. You can see that his discourse, his speech has not changed in all the years he's been there. He is always endlessly plodding on to get that done. To his own fault in some ways, although I like Bernie Sanders very much, it was his obsession with the minutiae, the sort of these small details, that allowed him to forged that idea of his, but he was unable to see the larger picture. He was unable to see that, but he has talents, and he set the agenda straight. He definitely escalated the conversation to a spot where it had to be. This is where it had to be. We had to get to this point in time. Bernie Sanders was the one that brought us to that conversation. Interesting person. Jimmy Fallon. We all know Jimmy Fallon from The Tonight Show. Very funny guy, and he has the same sort of characters, probably that is attention to detail, the ideas. And of course, don't forget, every sign has got a moon, it's got a rising sign, and a wide array of other planets that color the personality. But as a basic personality trait, we would see that there. Another interesting politician, Chris Christie, is also a Virgo. And so you could see that in his criticism. During the debate season when he was talking, he was incredibly critical of other people. That is a Virgo. That criticism is a Virgo trait, and it may not come across, oftentimes Virgos may not even know they're being this critical, but the criticism is there. There's this deep-seated sense of, you know, that gotcha kind of criticism that is there, and you just can't escape it. John McCain, also a Virgo. You know, you wouldn't think of him as a Virgo, but he is. He has that, you know, again, a senator, a very prominent senator in that mode of working, trying to work through, hash out details. He sometimes gets lost in the details of what it means to invade foreign countries. So, but this is just for point of reference. H.G. Wells, he wrote War of the Worlds, was a Virgo. George R.R. Martin is a Virgo. Very famous film producer and writer who was responsible for a number of very, very well-known public and offering television shows. Stephen King, my gosh. Here is a man whose imagination is wild and very, very interesting kind of character, and yet he has that attention to detail. He has that doggedness, that attention to detail that allows him to sit down and write an 800-page novel. This requires diligence, this requires minutia, this requires a constant repetitiveness, this sort of dogged kind of just plodding on, you know, relentless work ethic, very strong relentless work ethic that brings him to those great novels out there. And of course, there's the details. The devil's in the details. This is where Virgo really comes true. When you read one of his novels and you hear the details that are there, you get that chill, and that's exactly the master of great fiction. So thank God for him. Another one, Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa may very well be the epitome of what it means to be a Virgo. Tirelessly serving others, tirelessly helping others, a spiritual leader of the highest sort. And Virgos can be very spiritually oriented because of that sense of service. Their whole goal is to give unto others, to help unto others, to bring others along, to help them through their travails. And that is their greatest gift. And they do it willingly. They do this without any remorse, and they may throw a few barbs in, as I said, because they got their critical side going on. But for the most part, there's this strong sense of service. Service is there. Service is wonderful. They want to help others. And Mother Teresa is the epitome of that person. And one more person I have on my list is Marco Polo. Obviously, we don't know what time he was born, at least we don't think we do. But he was the great conqueror and interesting character in that respect as well. So by seeing the people that I've mentioned, this wide array of people, Lyndon Johnson, Michael Jackson, Bernie Sanders, these are all people who have strong Virgo traits and bring out that sort of earthbound quality. You know, there's something very rooted and ordinary about them that gives them that real strong sense of service. Service is where it's at. I bet you any money, you go ask your dentist or your doctor, somebody in their office is a Virgo, almost guaranteed. Same thing is true for accountants, bookkeepers, people who are very good with numbers, people who are very good with details, people who are detail-oriented. This is where you're going to find the Virgos. They are fascinating in that regard and can bring a great deal to they sort of provide that balance. They're the opposite of Pisces. And so if Pisces is lost in the clouds and dreaming and stuff like that, Virgo has their feet firmly planted in the earth, bound to be a detail-oriented, service-oriented, somewhat critical, and yet very adaptable person who's willing to bend and negotiate. If you have a Virgo in your life, you're a lucky person. You're probably getting treated very well. I'll talk to you all next time. Take care.